In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler controlled more of Europe than almost any man in history. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Britain was on its knees. His armies were undefeated. And then, at 3:15 in the morning, on June 22nd, 1941, he made a decision that would destroy everything he had built. He turned his army east, toward a country of 11 time zones, 200 million people, and a winter that had already buried one invader before him. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa and the fatal miscalculation that ended the Third Reich before it truly began.
To understand why Hitler did this, you have to understand that from his side, it wasn't madness at all. It was, in his mind, inevitable.
Hitler had written about conquering the Soviet Union years before he came to power. In his book, Mein Kampf, he talked about Lebensraum, living space, the idea that Germany needed to expand eastward into Slavic lands to feed and house its people for generations to come. But there was more to it than ideology. By mid-1941, Hitler had 3 practical reasons pushing him toward war with Stalin. First, oil and grain. Germany's war machine ran on Romanian oil and Soviet grain shipments, and Hitler didn't trust that supply to last. Control the Soviet Union, and that problem disappears forever. Second, Britain. Hitler couldn't finish off Britain. He'd failed to win the Battle of Britain in the air, and an invasion across the Channel looked more impossible by the day. But he believed, wrongly as it turned out, that Britain was only holding on because it hoped the Soviet Union would eventually join the fight against Germany. Knock out the USSR, Hitler reasoned, and Britain's last hope disappears with it. Third, and maybe most dangerous of all, Hitler had convinced himself the Red Army was weak. Stalin had executed roughly half of his own officer corps in purges just a few years earlier. Soviet forces had struggled badly against tiny Finland in the Winter War of 1939 and 1940. German generals looked at that performance and drew the wrong conclusion. Hitler told his generals the whole campaign would be over in a matter of weeks. "We only have to kick in the door," he reportedly said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He was about to find out how wrong that sentence was. What Hitler unleashed on June 22, 1941, remains to this day the largest military invasion ever launched. Over 3 million German soldiers, roughly 3,500 tanks, something close to 3,000 aircraft, all of it crashing across a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The attack was split into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North aimed at Leningrad. Army Group Center drove straight toward Moscow. Army Group South pushed into Ukraine, toward the resource-rich Caucasus. And at first, it worked exactly like Hitler predicted. Stalin had ignored repeated warnings of the coming invasion from his own spies, from British intelligence, even from a German defector. He believed until the last possible moment that Hitler wouldn't dare break their non-aggression pact. When the attack came, entire Soviet air fleets were destroyed on the ground before a single plane got airborne. Whole armies were encircled and captured within days. By the end of the first week, German forces had advanced further than they had in the first month of fighting France. It looked, for a moment, like Hitler had been right. But underneath the early victories, 3 problems were already forming. Problems that would eventually swallow the entire German army. Problem 1, the distances involved were almost incomprehensible. The Soviet Union wasn't France.
Supply lines that worked perfectly for a 6-week campaign in Western Europe began to collapse under the sheer scale of Russian geography. German trains ran on a different rail gauge than Soviet tracks, meaning captured Soviet railways had to be rebuilt before they could even be used.
Problem 2. Hitler kept changing the plan. In August 1941, with his forces just a few hundred miles from Moscow, Hitler made a fateful decision. Instead of pushing straight for the Soviet capital while the momentum was still there, he diverted Army Group Center south to help capture Ukraine and the city of Kyiv. It was, on paper, a huge victory. Over 600,000 Soviet troops captured in a single encirclement. But it cost Hitler something he could never get back: time.
Problem 3. Winter was coming, and the German army wasn't ready for it. German planners had been so confident of a quick victory that most soldiers were never issued proper winter clothing. By the time the attack on Moscow finally resumed in October, autumn rains had turned Russian roads into swamps of mud. The Soviets called this season Rasputitsa, the time when the roads disappear. German tanks and trucks sank axle deep. The advance slowed to a crawl just as the temperature began to fall. By early December 1941, German reconnaissance units could reportedly see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were that close. And then the temperature dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero. German tanks froze solid. Machine guns jammed because the oil inside them turned to sludge. Soldiers who had marched 1,000 miles across the summer and autumn were now fighting frostbite as much as they were fighting the enemy. Tens of thousands of German troops suffered frostbite injuries that winter alone. Meanwhile, Stalin had a card Hitler didn't count on. Soviet intelligence had learned that Japan had no intention of attacking from the east, which meant Stalin could bring in fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions, soldiers trained and outfitted for exactly this kind of brutal winter warfare.
On December 5th, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began.
Logistics
German
bowed to the
forces,
brutal winter.
exhausted, frozen, and stretched to their absolute limit, were pushed back from the outskirts of Moscow.
The blitzkrieg that was supposed to end in 6 weeks was still going after 6 months, and it would not end for nearly 4 more years. Operation Barbarossa never officially failed in a single dramatic moment. It just simply ground on, through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through a war of attrition that Germany could never win. The numbers, even now, are staggering. Historians estimate that somewhere between 20 and 27 million Soviet citizens, soldiers and civilians combined, died as a result of the war on the Eastern Front. German military losses on that front alone are estimated at well over 3 million. The Eastern Front consumed the vast majority of Germany's army for the rest of the war, while Hitler was still trying to fight Britain and eventually the United States in the West. Historians still debate the single moment that doomed the campaign. Was it the diversion to Kyiv in August that cost Hitler the window to take Moscow before winter? Or was it simply the decision to invade at all, underestimating both the size of the country and the resolve of the people defending it? Most agree it wasn't one mistake. It was a chain of them, all stemming from the same overconfidence that had made Hitler unstoppable in Western Europe. Hitler once told his generals that they only had to kick in the door and the whole structure would collapse. Instead, he kicked open a door that would eventually consume nearly 80% of all German military casualties in the entire war, and set in motion the collapse of his own empire. Operation Barbarossa is one of history's clearest lessons in what happens when ambition outruns preparation, and when a leader believes his own propaganda about the enemy he's about to face. If you want to see what happened next, the turning point at Stalingrad, where Germany's 6th Army met its end, let me know in the comments and subscribe for the next chapter in this story.